Hi everyone, thanks so much for checking out my channel, and thanks especially for checking out this video. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you've probably noticed that I very rarely contradict the consensus perspective of academicians. I try to give a lot of credit to some of the prominent scholars in biblical studies field, and I've quoted a lot of these individuals several times, including Dale Allison, E.P. Sanders, Bart Ehrman, Paul Fredrickson, and many others. I always engage respectfully and frequently defer to a lot of these folks. But there is a perspective that's often cited as the scholarly consensus that I'm going to disagree with in this video. And if you watch through to the end of this video, then I think you'll either have to agree with me that the evidence does not support the consensus opinion, or even if you do still agree with that opinion, then the claims that the opinion is based on are at least more tenuous than what many people will present. I'm a university professor, and I'm an editor of 2 journals in my field, but as most of you already know, I'm not in the field of theology nor historical scholarship. But I'm going to try to use my academic perspective to really get to the heart of what the evidence shows and where it actually is not that strong. In fact, I would argue that if I had this qualitative evidence for almost any claim in my own field, it definitely wouldn't be enough to gain the scholarly consensus. So today we're going to evaluate a very well-respected theory that Jesus was a failed apocalyptical prophet. Now, on the images in this presentation, I might present this as the FAP argument for a failed apocalyptical prophet. As a new channel, we're actually getting close to 500 subscribers right now, and I've only had this channel for under a year, so I'm really grateful for all of your support. But if you get something out of this video, please like the video, please subscribe to the channel, please click the bell icon for notifications, and please get at me in the comment section. I think we're going to have a really lively chat about this. Now, this conversation is going to be a little more dry than some of my videos because we're asking an academic question, so our methodology has to really reflect that intent. But if you pay attention to the evidence, then I think you'll be rewarded by a more fulfilling understanding on this topic. All right, here we go. Section 1. What did Jesus actually say, and how do we know? Believe it or not, this is actually a pretty big gap, and it's especially relevant for this argument. Most people agree that Jesus didn't say the things quoted in the New Testament verbatim. So we aren't going to argue that exact quotes are ever really valid. But beyond that, before we move further, we need to have an evaluative criteria for how we can figure out what Jesus said and what he didn't say. So this section is going to establish essentially a trustworthiness filter for each passage. Again, I don't think that a systematic approach like this is very well established in the academic literature, so what I did is I looked at how scholars determine what Jesus reliably said, again, not verbatim, but what were the points that he actually made. So first, I tried to develop a set of criteria for evaluating the historical reliability of Jesus' sayings. These aren't invented from scratch, and they draw on the standard methodological toolkit of historical Jesus scholarship. And I'm often going to cite many of the leading scholars in this field. What's different about this video is that it applies these criteria consistently to every saying, regardless of where the conclusion points. And I think it creates a good uniform threshold for what we can trust and what we should be suspicious about. Now, my trustworthiness filter is based on several major and minor criteria. The major criteria are more important in order to reliably determine how likely a statement reflects a contemporaneous teaching of Jesus. And the minor criteria are less important but still valuable. And there are major and minor criteria on both sides of the decision calculus. So some criteria are meant to increase our confidence that a statement of Jesus was likely close to what he actually said, and other criteria are meant to show that a statement of Jesus wasn't as likely to be a real reflection of his teachings. Now, no single criterion in this framework is treated as decisive. Historical confidence increases when multiple major criteria converge, optionally supported by minor criteria, and that confidence decreases when the criteria point in the opposite direction. All right, so first we'll look at the major criteria which increase reliability. The first is repeated teachings. So teachings that appear repeatedly within the tradition are more likely to reflect stable transmissions rather than isolated invention. So second is independent sources. So teachings present in distinct source streams, for example, the Synoptic Gospels, the Gospel of John, and the Pauline sources carry increased historical weight. The third criteria is mnemonic format. So teachings preserved as parables, aphorisms, creedal summaries, or other orally transmissible structures are more plausibly early in origin. And the fourth is thematic embedding. So these are teachings that are underscored in narrative settings or framed with specific events. So this suggests that there's a persistent core rather than an editorial construction. Now here are the minor criteria that increase reliability. The first is initial resistance. So teachings that appear difficult, counterintuitive, or slow to gain acceptance are less likely to be retroactively fabricated. The second is stylistic or rhetorical discontinuity, so sayings that exhibit aphoristic density or metaphorical precision distinct from the surrounding narrative prose may reflect pre-literary material. One such important feature that we might look at is a change in language. So if we see words or phrases in Aramaic, that might mean that we're looking at an important early or even contemporaneous understanding. So these are the criteria that would suggest that we should be more suspicious about the validity of a passage. So the first is interpolations. So this is clear evidence of later interpolation or secondary theological development. So where textual, linguistic, or conceptual features strongly suggest later insertion, confidence should be decreased accordingly. The second is conflicting statements. So conflicting statements that are difficult to reconcile through plausible, simple explanations warrant increased caution, though contradiction alone doesn't necessarily imply inauthenticity. The third is miraculous prophetic insights. Now this may be a little more controversial for some, but if we have a claim that invokes some sort of miraculous or prophetic insight, we should always be more cautious. And that's the rubric that I'm employing here. Such sayings may reflect post-event interpretation or theological elaboration, and therefore they merit careful scrutiny rather than automatic exclusion. And the fourth is isolated statements. So teachings without supporting features elsewhere in the tradition should be treated with proportionate reserve. Now here's the minor criterion which would decrease reliability. Apologetical resolutions. So these are teachings that neatly secure authority or produce rhetorically ideal outcomes in controversial scenes, and these may represent editorial shaping as well. Now, just one final word. You can actually create a numerical scoring system from these criteria. To my knowledge, this hasn't really been done, but you could say that each claim starts at 0, and then each major criterion adds +3 or -3 points to the validity of a particular passage or claim, and you could add +1 or -1 points for minor criteria features. Okay, I know that was kind of long and dry, but I think we really need an even, justifiable academic set of criteria, and I think that these criteria that I've listed off get us pretty close to a neutral starting point. Now, I like these criteria because there is some objectivity. They force us to look at methodological concerns before we've decided on our theological convictions. So we're deciding on how we're going to weigh each statement before we find out where that conclusion would actually point us. Also, even though I'm citing applications of each criterion to biblical scholarship, these criteria incorporate tenets and ideas that are widely applicable to textual criticism. Now, before we get into the actual passages, and we are going to go through them carefully one by one, first, I want to clarify how I define independence of the source material. So the rule that I'm applying consistently throughout is this. When Matthew and Luke both carry a saying that also appears in Mark, I count that as one source stream, not three, because under Markan priority, both Matthew and Luke derive the sayings from Mark rather than from independent oral traditions. However, when Matthew and Luke both carry a saying that does not appear in Mark, and when their versions show meaningful variation in wording, I count that as two independent streams, because the variation is best explained by independent access to oral tradition rather than one copying from the other. So if Matthew and Luke have variations best explained by independent access to an oral or early tradition, and if they aren't in the category of both just copying from Mark, again for the respective passages, then those would count as independent sources. Now, if you catch any uneven application of this rule, please do let me know. All right, on to section 2. What did Jesus actually say? And here we're going to do a phrase-by-phrase analysis. Now, I know there's a lot of organizational structure in this video, but we really do need to be systematic and neutral here. So let me walk you through the actual sayings that FAP proponents cite and some that they tend to not cite, and I'm going to organize all these passages into 4 categories. Category A are sayings that specify a time frame tied to the current generation. So these are eschatological references plus a specific time frame. Category B are sayings that are eschatological in register, but they're temporally unspecified or at least referentially ambiguous. So these are mostly about eschatology, but without a clear timeline. Category C sayings establish urgency or imminence as a disposition with no specific time frame claim. So a sense of imminent moral importance without a calendar prediction. Category D are sayings that specifically argue against the possibility of knowing a timeline at all. So these are passages where there's explicit denial that a timeline can be known. Now, as we work through all these passages, we're going to apply our trustworthiness filters, our evaluative criteria from section 1. So we'll have a bit of a qualitative sense of which category of Jesus' statements are more reliable. So category A are sayings that specify a time frame. Now, the best example is Mark 13:30 and its synoptic parallels. This generation will not pass away until all these things have happened. This is the load-bearing beam of the entire FAP argument. If any saying qualifies as a specific calendar prediction, it's this one. FAP proponents are right to focus here. This is their strongest evidence, and we should be open that it makes a good case in and of itself. By the way, people on all sides of this conversation all would say that this is the strongest piece of evidence, at least, if not the load-bearing beam. Now, let's run through our evaluative criteria. On the criteria that increase reliability, does it appear in independent source streams? Well, the answer here is no. Matthew 24:34 and Luke 21:32 carry the same saying, but under Markan priority, which is the dominant scholarly position, both Matthew and Luke very likely derived it from Mark rather than from independent traditions. This is one source appearing 3 times, not 3 independent sources. That might seem like a minor weakness, but as we go through these, you'll see the issues are going to keep mounting. Now, on the criteria that decrease reliability, does it conflict with other sayings? Well, yes, directly and immediately. Mark 13:32, which we'll get to in category D, is the very next passage and explicitly states that no one knows the day or the hour, not even the sun. That's a contradiction sitting in the very same passage. Our criteria tells us that conflicting statements warrant at the very least increased caution. Beyond the criteria, there are some additional problems with this saying that we should mention. First, the syntactic ordering of where this statement appears is very important. The Olivet discourse moves through 2 distinguishable phases. The first phase contains warnings about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and the second phase describes cosmic events surrounding the parousia, which is the final coming of the Son of Man. This sentence, "This generation will not pass away," sits at the structural hinge between these 2 phases. If that sentence concludes the first phase, its referent, what it refers to, is the generation that will see Jerusalem fall, which happened in 70 CE, which is within a normal generational span. And if that's the case, then it's not a failed prediction at all. But if this statement is part of the second phase, then it is indeed a failed prediction about the cosmic events that did not occur. But here's the significant observation. If we move this sentence around by just a little bit, it winds up having a very different meaning. So it's not only the meaning of this sentence that matters, it's actually its position. So the entire FAP argument actually depends on placement. But for that placement to be reliable, the tradition must have preserved not just the content of the saying, but its precise sequential ordering within a very complex compound discourse. We've already agreed that sayings are not verbatim transcripts. We know that oral transmission units circulated independently before being compiled. So we know the 3 synoptic versions show editorial variation in the surrounding material. So here's what this means. The FAP interpretation depends not only on the authenticity of the saying itself, but also on the assumption that the tradition preserved its precise placement within a very complicated speech. So I want to clarify this point again, just because it's pretty important. For this phrase to prove the FAP argument, we have to agree not only that it's an accurate reflection of the teachings of Jesus, but also that it was actually said in the precise order where it appears. Now that's a much more tenuous case. All right, now second, we should talk a little bit about the word generation. The Greek word genea, translated as generation, is not exclusively just a chronological generation in the original ancient Greek. In Second Temple Jewish usage, the term can denote a morally characterized type of person rather than a strict chronological cohort. Biologists will actually recognize something similar here. The word genera in biology is very close, and it's just the plural of genus. This is a grouping shared by characteristics rather than by time. Genera, genes, and genea actually all share a common Indo-European root. In Koine and broader Hellenistic Greek, the noun genea does not always refer strictly to a chronological generation, but can also denote a kind or a stock or a type of people. This wider semantic range appears both in Jewish Greek texts and also in classical Greek literature that continued to shape Hellenistic usage. For example, in the Greek Septuagint, the word frequently describes a moral class rather than a temporal cohort. Psalms 24:6, for example, says, "This is the genea," or "This is the generation of those who seek the Lord." Here, it's actually clearly referring to the category of people characterized by seeking God rather than to a specific 30 or 40-year age group. The qualitative sense is also reflected in the wider Greek literature. Aristotle uses genea in biological contexts to refer to a stock or lineage, meaning a kind or breed within a broader class of living things. Similarly, the Hellenistic historian Polybius employs the term to describe a family line or type of people within a social group, again emphasizing lineage or category rather than chronological succession. The New Testament reflects the same semantic flexibility. Paul echoes Deuteronomy in Philippians 2:15 when he speaks of believers living in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. This refers to a corrupt type of society rather than merely the people living within a particular time span. And lexical authorities like Liddell Scott Jones have recognized that genea can denote people of the same kind or class characterized by particular qualities, not merely those belonging to the same historical generation. These examples show that within the linguistic environment of Hellenistic Greek, the word could naturally function as a qualitative description of a type of people as well as a temporal generation. I do want to underscore that the consensus here is that the word genea refers to a generation in Mark 13:30, but I think looking more broadly, I don't know of any convincing argument that establishes that this refers to a temporal generation rather than more broadly a type or subclass. And we haven't addressed enough the immediate contradictions that are there, but we'll get to some of those in category D. But as we said in our evaluative criteria, we should be more cautious and skeptical when we find a report of a statement that's contradicted by a separate report elsewhere. All right, so here's the summary for Mark 13:30. It is weak in terms of multiple attestations. It's directly contradicted by adjacent material. It's dependent on a specific sequential ordering that oral transmission theory gives us reason to question, and it relies on a single reading of a lexically contested word. This is the strongest piece of FAP evidence, and it has some serious problems. The next passage is Matthew 10:23. Some of you will not finish going through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Now, on the criteria, this appears only in Matthew's M source with no parallel in Mark or Luke, so it is isolated. Our criteria tells us that isolated statements should be treated with proportionate reserve. It also involves a phrase, the Son of Man comes, whose referent is contested across at least 5 major scholarly interpretations. This could refer to Jesus physically rejoining the disciples on their mission. It could refer to the resurrection. It could refer to the Pentecost. It could refer to the destruction of Jerusalem or the second coming. When a saying has that many plausible readings, its evidentiary weight for any single reading should probably be reduced. Even Dale Allison, one of the leading FAP scholars, argues this need not constitute a failed prediction because Matthew never records the mission to Israel as completed. If the mission is ongoing, the time frame remains open. So here's the summary for Matthew 10:23. It's isolated in a single source, its referent is genuinely contested, and even FAP proponents acknowledge that it doesn't clearly constitute a failed prediction. Now this is borderline category A at best. And those are the only 2 sayings in category A. Those 2 sayings with one of them borderline, that's the entire evidentiary foundation for the specific calendar prediction claim. Now already we have a pretty tenuous case, but we're going to see that it actually gets diluted even further the more we look at other passages. So category B statements are eschatological in register, but temporally unspecified. The first one is Mark 9:1. Some standing here will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God come in power. Now, admittedly, this could be considered a category A statement, but FAP proponents often treat this as strong supporting evidence alongside Mark 13:30. But let's look at how the eschatological reading is actually established. So it's almost entirely derived from the immediately preceding verse, which is Mark 8:38, which describes the Son of Man coming in glory. The argument is, because 8:38 is eschatological, 9:1 must be read in the same register. Now that's a contextual inference about editorial arrangement, and it's not an independent piece of evidence. And it depends on the assumption that the editorial arrangement faithfully reflects original sequential context, which is exactly the assumption we've already seen reason to question. On our trustworthiness criteria, the saying appears in Matthew 16:28 and Luke 9:27, but both are again Markan dependents. So it's again one source with 3 appearances. And the real problem is that the referent of come in power is also genuinely contested. Plausible options include the transfiguration. Now the transfiguration follows immediately in the Markan text. So many commentators throughout history have read 9:1 as an introduction to the transfiguration, but it could also refer to the resurrection, to the Pentecost, and to the already present inverted kingdom. There's also a deeper issue here. The eschatological reading assumes the Son of Man coming language invokes Daniel 7:13. But in Daniel 7, the Son of Man comes toward the Ancient of Days, meaning upward toward the divine throne, not downward to earth in cosmic judgment. N.T. Wright in Jesus and the Victory of God argues at length that this language describes vindication and enthronement, which maps onto the resurrection and ascension far more naturally than onto physical earthly apocalypse. That is a contested reading, but it's a serious one from a serious scholar, and it means the eschatological reading of this verse isn't obvious. So here's the summary for Mark 9:1. It depends on editorial inference rather than the saying itself. it's a single source stream, its referent is genuinely contested across multiple plausible options, and the Danielic frame supports possible alternative readings. Now, the next passage is Mark 13:26 and also Mark 8:38. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with great power and glory. And also, when the Son of Man comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. Now, this is visually dramatic. It's certainly eschatological in register, but neither of these statements contains a temporal marker. They describe an event without specifying when it's going to occur. And again, the same Danielic analysis applies. So this is firmly in category B. I think from a neutral reading, this doesn't help advance the argument. Now, category C are statements about urgency without a specific time frame. Now, here's what FAP proponents tend not to dwell on. There is a large body of sayings where Jesus addresses urgency and moral readiness without making any specific calendar claim. These aren't peripheral, and these statements actually score well on our reliability criteria. Before walking through them, I want to add one interpretive point that I think is genuinely underappreciated. Several of Jesus' urgency teachings apply naturally to individuals facing their own mortality. God comes like a thief in the night, not only eschatologically, but also in each person's own life. The need for moral readiness is immediate because any individual may die at any moment. This hermeneutical key unlocks the urgency language across the tradition without requiring cosmic calendar prediction, and it is entirely consistent with Jesus' broader emphasis on the immediacy of moral accountability. It's also congruent with what Jesus generally does with his language. He teaches an aphorism, but he applies it to individuals and to society in different ways. All right, the first phrase is Mark 1:15. The kingdom of God is at hand, repent and believe. Now, on the criteria, this teaching is thematically embedded across multiple narrative contexts in the tradition and expressed in a mnemonic format, so it does score well. But what does it say about timing? It calls for immediate moral orientation. At hand in prophetic idiom signals present relevance, not a calendar prediction. Also, again, we have the question of what the kingdom of God refers to. And this isn't just an academic point. Jesus uses the phrase kingdom of God numerous times, and very frequently he's using it in a deeply metaphorical context. So I don't think you can squeeze a specific eschatological prediction out of it. And this is firmly in category C. Now let's look at the parable of the thief in the night. This is Matthew 24 and Luke 12. On the criteria, this is a mnemonic parable, which is one of the most orally transmissible formats possible, which is a positive reliability indicator. It appears in two independent source streams, Matthew and Luke, which is genuinely multiple attestations, so it scores well as a trustworthy statement by our criteria for a few different reasons. Now, what does it say? It explicitly denies knowable timing. The entire rhetorical logic of the parable depends on the timing being unknown. A homeowner who knew when the thief was coming would stay awake. You don't know, therefore you always have to stay vigilant. This is not a prediction of imminence, it's a denial of predictability. So this is category C, and it's also robustly attested. Now we'll look at the parable of the 10 virgins. This is Matthew 25. Now on the criteria, this is a mnemonic parable. So it's a good orally transmissible format. It's thematically embedded in Matthew's eschatological discourse, so this scores well. But what does it say? The bridegroom is explicitly delayed. The virgins grow weary of waiting. The moral is preparedness across an indefinite period of uncertainty. If Jesus thought the end was coming within a generation, why tell people a parable where the dramatic tension depends entirely on unexpected and extended delay? This is firmly, again, category C. Now let's look at the parable of the faithful and unfaithful servant. We find this in Matthew 24 and Luke 12. This is a mnemonic parable. We have two independent source streams, and we have genuinely multiple attestations. So this scores well on our criteria. The servant who acts badly is the one who says, my master is delayed. The master's return is unexpected, not imminent. The moral depends on indefinite rather than imminent timing. So this is, again, firmly category C. And we'll look at the parable of the talents, which is Matthew 25. A man goes on a long journey before returning. The entire narrative structure implies extended absence. Luke carries an independent version of this in chapter 19 with enough variation, different stakes, different framing, a different setting, to suggest that two streams draw on a common tradition rather than one copying from the other. All right, now we'll move on to category D. These are sayings that explicitly deny a knowable timing. So this is the category that I think deserves the most attention because these sayings don't just fail to specify a time frame, they actively argue against the possibility of knowing one. And on our reliability criteria, they actually score exceptionally well. The first one we'll look at is Matthew 24:36 and Mark 13:32. But about the day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Let's run this through the evaluative criteria carefully because this is very important. On independent sources, this appears in both Matthew and Mark. Matthew almost certainly derived it from Mark, so this is one source. But what is strong here is thematic embedding. The same idea that the timing is unknowable appears across multiple independent sayings and parables throughout the tradition. On mnemonic format, this is a direct aphoristic statement in form that is highly memorable and easily transmitted orally, so this is a positive indicator. On the embarrassment criterion, here is the crucial point. This saying limits the knowledge of the Son. No early Christian community has any conceivable theological motive to invent a tradition that makes Jesus appear less omniscient. It's genuinely embarrassing to the high Christology that was developing in the early church. By the embarrassment criteria that FAP proponents themselves invoke to authenticate the timing claims, this saying should score as highly authentic. But here's where the FAP methodology creates a direct contradiction for itself. FAP proponents use embarrassment criteria to establish the authenticity of the imminent timing claims, arguing that an embarrassing saying is unlikely to have been invented. But then, when the embarrassment criterion authenticates this saying, which directly undermines those claims, they treat it as a later softening addition, rather than authentic early teaching. So they're applying their own criterion selectively. Embarrassment authenticates what supports FAP. Embarrassment is set aside when it challenges FAP. That is not a consistent methodology. So here's the summary from Matthew 24:36 and Mark 13:32. It's strong on the embarrassment criterion by the FAP scholar's own logic. It's aphoristic and there's a memorable format. It's also thematically embedded across the tradition. This is among the most reliably attested sayings in the dataset by any consistent application of the criteria, and it explicitly denies that anyone, including the Son, can know when. By the way, if there's one statement that I think scores the best in the evaluative criteria, I think this might be it. Then we come to Matthew 25:13. Keep watch, for you do not know the day or the hour. Now, this is the concluding moral of the 10 virgins parable. It's direct, it's aphoristic, and it's mnemonic. The saying is the distilled teaching of one of the most robustly attested parables in the tradition. Firmly, this is category D. Now we come to Acts 1:7. It's not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority. Now this is post-resurrection. The disciples ask about the restoration of the kingdom, and the risen Jesus explicitly redirects them away from timeline speculation. If Jesus had spent his ministry insisting the apocalypse was coming within a generation, this exchange is almost inexplicable. Why would he redirect his closest followers away from the timeline thinking immediately after the resurrection if he had spent 3 years giving them a specific time frame? Now, I should note that Acts shares an author with the Gospel of Luke, so this is not an independent source stream. I'm just citing it as corroborating evidence within the Luke tradition rather than a separate attestation. Now we come to Matthew 24:6-8 and Mark 13:7-8. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places, but the end is still to come. All these are the beginning of birth pangs. So here's another passage that is not a prediction of imminence. It's the opposite. Jesus is explicitly telling his disciples that the events unfolding around them, the wars, the upheavals, the disasters, are not the end. The end is still to come. The phrase beginning of birth pangs frames these events as a long lead-up, not a terminal event. Birth pangs are the start of a process, not its conclusion. Now, N.T. Wright has argued, and I think correctly, that this language describes a historical period of indeterminate length rather than a compressed final sequence. The grammar implies iterative, recurring events. You will hear of wars, plural, repeated, ongoing. Multiple wars implies a period of several years, as does the phrase multiple famines. But nations and kingdoms rising up is the language of multiple generations. Nations will rise up against nations. That's a pattern that describes history as such rather than a single crisis. This is the language of a teacher who expects a substantial stretch of time before the end, not a teacher telling his listeners the end arrives within their lifetimes. Now, FAP proponents will respond that Jesus is simply describing the lead up to the imminent end, not an indefinite historical period. But that response requires smuggling in the imminence back from elsewhere. The passage itself contains no imminence marker. The end is still to come, points away from imminence. And if the category A saying in Mark 13:30 is the source of the imminence reading, then we're back to the same problem. That reading depends on an undefended sequential placement within the discourse. You can't use the conclusion of the discourse to establish the meaning of its middle sections and then use those middle sections to confirm the conclusion. All right, now we come to Matthew 24:14 and Mark 13:10. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. This is perhaps the most underappreciated saying in the entire Olivet discourse. Jesus places an explicit condition on the end arriving. The gospel must first be proclaimed throughout the whole world to all nations. Then the end will come. That's not an imminent prediction. It's actually a conditional deferral. The saying also introduces a condition. The gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations before the end arrives. However this phrase is interpreted, it suggests a process rather than an immediate conclusion. Early Christians themselves believed that the message was spreading rapidly across the Roman world. Yet, even within the New Testament, this mission is portrayed as ongoing rather than complete. The statement therefore sits uneasily alongside the claim that the end was expected within the lifetime of the current generation. Now, here's the internal consistency problem that this creates for the FAP argument. If Mark 13:30 is a prediction that the cosmic end arrives within the current generation, and Matthew 24:14 in the same discourse says the end is conditioned on a global mission that no first century person could reasonably expect to complete within a generation, then the discourse is internally contradictory. FAP proponents can't have it both ways. Either the discourse is coherent, in which case 24:14 substantially qualifies whatever timeframe 1330 implies, or the discourse is incoherent, in which case it cannot be used to establish confident calendar predictions in either direction. All right, so let me just do a brief recap of what we've got so far on the table in terms of evidence. So we've got category A, which is one clear saying in one source stream with weak multiple attestations, and it's directly contradicted by adjacent material. Plus, there's one other borderline saying in a single source with a contested referent. Then we have category B, which are sayings that are eschatological in register, but whose temporal claims depend entirely on contestable inferences about editorial context and the direction of the Danielic Son of Man. Then we have category C, which is a large body of urgency and readiness sayings, with many of them in mnemonic parable forms, some with genuine multiple attestation, and these score well on our reliability criteria. And these establish moral urgency, but they don't establish any calendar claim. And then we have category D, which is a cluster of sayings that explicitly deny the possibility of knowing the timing, including one that is deeply embarrassing to the tradition and should therefore score as highly authentic by FAP proponents' own criteria. Now here's the question. The FAP case asks you to privilege category A over categories C and D. It asks you to treat one weakly attested saying as the authentic core and treat the larger, more robustly attested cluster that contradicts it as later editorial softening. And it does this without a consistent methodological justification. In other words, it doesn't show why the smaller, weaker category wins out. That's not a conclusion that the evidence forces, it's an interpretive choice. And it is a choice that the criteria we established in section 1, if applied consistently, does not support. Now, before we move on, I do want to talk about the embarrassment asymmetry of the FAP argument. FAP proponents use the criterion of embarrassment to authenticate the failed prediction. A saying that makes Jesus look wrong is unlikely to have been invented by his followers. But watch what happens with the temple destruction. Ehrman accepts the temple destruction prediction as authentic on the basis of multiple attestations across independent layers, not embarrassment. Other skeptics call it invented after the fact to make Jesus look prophetic. The pattern is sayings that damage Jesus' credibility get authenticated by embarrassment. Sayings that support his credibility either get authenticated by a different criterion or get dismissed as a post-event invention. The asymmetry is documentable across the literature around the FAP argument. The proponents won't explicitly call this a double standard, but looking at it from a neutral perspective, I think that's what it is. Now, let me add several arguments that operate at a different level. The first is the cultural and sociological prior. First century Judea was saturated with apocalyptic expectation under conditions that sociological research identifies as generative of millenarian movements. Norman Cohn, in The Pursuit of the Millennium, one of the foundational scholarly works on this topic, documents that millenarian movements arose repeatedly among what he calls the unprivileged, the oppressed, the disoriented, and the unbalanced. First century Judea met every condition Cohn identifies: political subjugation under Roman occupation, economic exploitation, social marginalization, a sharp dualistic worldview, and an almost total loss of agency through conventional means. Michael Barkun, in Disaster and the Millennium, extends this analysis with a specific finding directly relevant here. Millenarian movements arise as a consequence of compounded disasters, and one disaster is never enough. It takes stacked, simultaneous pressures. First century Judea, again, really meets the threshold criteria here. There was Roman military occupation, there was systemic economic exploitation, there was social marginalization, there was a sharply dualistic worldview, and again, almost a total loss of agency through conventional political means. And these were all operating at once. Vittorio Lanternari's The Religions of the Oppressed, a cross-cultural comparative study covering Africa, Asia, Melanesia, Polynesia, and the Americas, shows the same pattern emerging independently across cultures with no shared tradition. In every case, it emerges as a response to oppression and the collapse of normal social structures. When you find the same phenomenon arising independently across dozens of cultures under the same social conditions, you're looking at a documented human mechanism, not a theological peculiarity. Now, other apocalyptical figures were active in precisely the same period: John the Baptist, Theudas, the Egyptian prophet, the teacher of righteousness at Qumran. There was both a supply of and a demand for this message. And when there is that kind of demand, there's pressure on the tradition. Communities that want to hear imminent apocalyptic content are more likely to transmit it, to remember it, and to emphasize it. This raises the prior probability that imminent timing was attributed to Jesus by his community rather than originating with him. It also raises the risk of source confusion, where the teachings of contemporaneous apocalyptic figures were conflated with the teachings of Jesus over time. So we know that apocalypticism would have been high. Here's why this matters. All scholars agree that the New Testament isn't just about the teachings of Jesus. It's about how those teachings were received and recorded. It's essentially undeniable that apocalyptic expectations and aspirations were very high in first century Judea. It's very easy to imagine that someone writing down the statements of Jesus would have recorded those statements through the lens of higher apocalyptic expectations. That's not a reflection of Jesus, it's a reflection on the sociological milieu of first century Judea. We would expect a more tinted coloration in the lens of how the teachings of Jesus were received. And it's very reasonable to expect that the way people received the teachings of Jesus was influenced by this coloration. First century Judea has all the hallmarks of all of the sociological features that would have made listeners filter the words of Jesus through a lens of apocalypticism. Now, I also want to add a cognitive mechanism that operates at the level of individual perception and memory. We know that trauma produces a foreshortened sense of the future, hypervigilance to threats, reduced clarity in imagining positive future events, and persistent, exaggerated negative beliefs about the world and specifically the future. Those are actually the textbook features of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Klein and colleagues in a 2014 peer-reviewed study showed that PTSD is specifically associated with reduced clarity in imagining future events directly related to appraisals of foreshortened future and permanent change. Radcliffe and colleagues document that deliberate interpersonal trauma leads to what they call narrative foreclosure, the premature conviction that one's life story has effectively ended. First century Judean communities were living under conditions that would produce these responses at a population level. Now, I want to be precise about what I'm claiming. This is a plausibility argument. I'm not clinically diagnosing ancient communities. I'm pointing out that the psychological mechanisms exist by which sustained threats distort our temporal perception. And as a result of this, there would be magnified urgency and also the conditions necessary to activate all of the mechanisms of PTSD. People who experience the world as dangerous and their future is foreshortened will receive, remember, and transmit teachings with greater urgency and specificity than was intended. All of these factors mean that if Jesus said something about the Parousia, the people writing down his words would have heard that this eschatology was imminent, and they would have likely recorded the words with a greater sense of imminence and through the lens of a foreshortened sense of the future. All right, let's talk about the work of Leon Festinger because it's often cited in the FAP argument. Leon Festinger's When Prophecy Fails is frequently cited by FAP proponents to explain why the early Christian movement didn't collapse when the apocalypse failed to materialize. Communities don't necessarily abandon failed prophets, they reinterpret. The softening of apocalyptic urgency from Mark to John is read as evidence of that reinterpretation in action. But Festinger's framework documents something else as well. Communities under prophetic pressure do not only soften teachings after failure, they also intensify and sharpen vague or symbolic language into concrete, urgent claims because imminence is motivating and because proselytization-friendly communities reward urgency. The same framework invoked to explain the preservation of failed predictions equally explains the addition of imminence to non-imminent teachings early in the transmission process. So Festinger does cut both ways. The community's tendency to reinterpret and intensify is equally consistent with the view that they added imminence to Jesus' teachings as with the view that they preserved a specific failed prediction. FAP proponents who cite Festinger as support have not reconciled themselves with the fact that they're holding a blade which cuts both ways. Now, there is a later decrease in apocalypticism, and FAP proponents read the gradual decrease in apocalyptic urgency from the earliest Christian sources to the later ones as evidence that the original teaching was more urgent and was being managed down in embarrassment. But there is an equally valid reading. Christianity produced measurable improvements in social conditions for its adherents, including increased care for the poor, the sick, and the marginalized. These are precisely the social conditions that Cohen identifies as generative of apocalypticism. As those conditions improved within Christian communities, the factors driving apocalyptic intensity diminished. Additionally, the broader pool of vocal apocalyptical prophets in the first century was drastically reduced after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. The decrease in apocalypticism is equally consistent with changing social conditions, as with embarrassment management. All right, now I briefly want to address some of the objections that I'm likely to encounter in the comment section of this video. So counter-argument 1 is the apocalyptic sandwich. The apocalyptic sandwich argument runs like this. John the Baptist preached imminent judgment, Paul's communities expected an imminent return, and Jesus stands in between them. A Jesus who also expected the imminent apocalypse makes the most sense of the tradition as a whole. Now, I want to grant the factual premises here. John probably did preach imminent judgment, although we don't know a lot of John's teachings. Paul's communities did expect imminent return, but let's look at this argument carefully. First, this is 2 external data points, not 3. Jesus is the subject of the argument. John and Paul are the 2 pieces of bread. Inferring the specific content of Jesus' teachings from 2 bracketing data points is a thin inferential basis for a settled conclusion. Second, and this is crucial, granting both data points actually strengthens the opaque lens argument rather than FAP. If both the predecessor tradition and the successor communities were saturated with apocalyptic expectation, that is precisely the cognitive and sociological environment in which non-imminent teachings would be received and transmitted with imminent coloring. The sandwich, if granted, is evidence that Jesus' teachings were received and transmitted through an intensely apocalyptic lens. So the sandwich also works in both ways. Third, our independent evidence about John's exact teachings is pretty thin. We have the Gospels and a brief passage in Josephus, but using John as a firm anchor point assumes the continuity the sandwich is supposed to prove. Now, I want to also push something else. The very presence of the sandwich argument means that we don't have a clearer case about the apocalypticism of the teachings of Jesus. Let me explain this a little further. If the apocalyptic teachings of Jesus were more clearly apocalyptic and with a specific time frame, we wouldn't need to justify the FAP argument with an appeal to other figures. We would just have enough prima facie evidence to make the case. The very fact that people make the case about Jesus by trying to harmonize Jesus' teachings with other figures shows that the case isn't that strong on its own. Now, counter-argument number 2 is Dale Allison's cumulative gestalt. Dale Allison is one of the most careful and intellectually honest FAP scholars, and he makes a version of the argument that you can't assess FAP by isolating individual passages. The overall tenor of the tradition, he argues, cumulatively points towards apocalyptic expectations. Even if individual sayings are ambiguous, the gestalt is for FAP. But there are several problems with this. First, you can't make a strong case by linking together a bunch of weak cases. Moreover, Allison's case is explicitly an appeal to a gestalt. He's saying that you have to use your overall impression. I would specifically reject this because it focuses less on the evidence and more on your own impression. I think the evaluative criteria that I've proposed are much more objective and keep us from having to appeal to overall impressions. Finally, I think that it can be flawed to ask people to make general impressions. When we see a rough edge in the data, we shouldn't artificially try to smooth it over. And again, as with the sandwich argument, I think the presence of this argument in the discourse shows that the evidence is actually pretty weak. We wouldn't have to rely on gestalt or general impressions if we had clearer data points, and that's exactly what this argument presupposes. Now, counter-argument number 3 is that there are ways to harmonize the conflicts and the tensions that exist between passages. I have heard this argument a lot. I'm not going to go too deeply into it, but I think that the harmonizations I've heard are all clumsy and clunky. If you can't know the day or hour, if no one can, then how do you know the generation? If you're saying that the eschatological events are coming within 40 years, then don't the people in year 39 know the dates with a bit more specificity? At the very least, it's an awkward claim. On the one hand, no one can know the time of God's eschatological judgment, but on the other hand, those who are in the final hours will have a pretty clear idea of what that hour is. So the conflicts and tensions can be harmonized, but the formulations that I have heard for those harmonizations aren't pretty. All right, now in the final section, I did start off section 1 with a set of evaluative criteria, and I said that you could actually develop a scoring system for each of these claims or passages. Now, if we do that, then we can actually give an overall score by adding up the points for each passage. When I did that, I got the scores that are on the screen now, and I actually performed this calculation twice, one with very liberal criteria, the other with very conservative criteria, so that there would be at least one model favoring the FAP argument. The point is that I would invite you to do your own calculations, but either way you score these arguments, it pretty clearly shifts the evidence against the FAP argument. And I think that's something that's pretty validated by the qualitative claims that we've made. All right, this video went a little bit longer than I wanted it to. And again, I know that the source material that we were covering was a little bit more dry than some of my other topics that I've covered on this channel, but I really do appreciate you watching to the very end of this video. I think what we've seen is that there is evidence for the FAP argument, but it's actually rather tenuous. And when we look at the balance of statements and the balance of statements that are much more validated, we see that they actually line up against the FAP argument. But that's what I think, and I really want to know more about what you think. Do you still believe in the FAP argument after considering all this evidence? How do you harmonize the conclusion that you have if you're a believer in the FAP argument with the evidence that I've outlined here? I'd be curious to know, and I'd really love to hear more about that in the comment section. Now, I just want to ask you again, I would love it if you click the like button on this video, especially if you get something out of it. Please subscribe to the channel, and please click the bell icon for notifications so that you don't miss out on future videos. And let me know any other topics you'd like me to cover in the comment section as well. And I know that it's the end of a long video and I've already asked a lot from many of you, but the final one thing that I'm going to ask for from all of you is that I hope you all please have a really wonderful day.